So we've made it through Unit 1 in our APES flipped classroom, and we're jumping into Unit 2. And Unit 2 is all about biodiversity. So we begin with an introduction to the term and different ways that we can quantify it. And so biodiversity is one of the measurements that we use as an indicator of the health of an ecosystem. So let's kind of talk about what it is, and then we'll talk about how we measure it. So we can measure biodiversity at a lot of different levels, and we can measure diversity in general at a lot of different levels. So we can kind of think of it as three different levels. So our broadest level is ecosystem diversity. And when we talk about ecosystem diversity, we're talking about in an area, how many different habitats are there available? So we know that each species has its own niche. And within a habitat, you can have multiple niches. And so we want to make sure that we have as many habitats within an ecosystem as possible, because that allows for better resilience or a better ability of the ecosystem to resist change. We can also talk about species diversity. So when we talk about species diversity, we're talking about the number of different species that are present in an ecosystem, as well as how balanced those species are, how evenly are the numbers of organisms distributed over the different species in the ecosystem. And then our last and kind of smallest level that we'll talk about is genetic diversity. When we talk about genetic diversity, we're talking about the individuals within a population. How different are their genomes? How different is their genetic makeup? And the higher their diversity is, that level of diversity, the genetic diversity, the better their chances of being able to survive, again, a change in their environment. The higher the biodiversity is, the higher the ecosystem and population health tends to be. And so this is why we use biodiversity as a measure of the health of an ecosystem. So we talked about species richness and evenness. So let's talk about what those two terms mean. So richness is just the total number of different species found in an ecosystem. It's nothing about how many of each type of species there are, but just how many species there are. And high richness is generally a good sign of ecosystem health. More species is going to mean that you have lots of resources. You have food, you have water, you have rich soil. So the stronger and healthier the ecosystem is, the more species you're going to have. Evenness is a measurement of how balanced the numbers or the distribution of the individuals in the ecosystem are. So when we talk about evenness, we're talking about if there's 5 different species of trees, do we have 5 of each, or do we have 20 of one and 1 or 2 of each of the others? So evenness is going to tell us if there's 1 or 2 dominant species, or if those population sizes are well balanced. So if we look at this example, we have a community of trees here on the left that have a certain number of types of trees. We have, I think, 4 different types of trees here, but there are equal numbers of each of those species. Community 2 has the same richness. It still has 4 different species of trees, but the vast majority of trees are all one species. And so it has high richness, but it doesn't have very good evenness. And so if something were to hit this community that attacked the one kind of tree that is dominant, then our community would lose a lot of its tree resources. And so more evenness provides a balance that allows ecosystems to be more resilient in the face of change. So we've looked at that is at the species level. Let's talk about at the genetic level. So why is genetic diversity important? Well, when we talk about genetic diversity, we're talking about how different the genomes are of the individuals within a population. So are they genetically similar, or are they very genetically different? All populations are going to have genetic diversity. There's always going to be random mutations when we copy DNA, when we recombine the chromosomes. That leads to new genetic combinations and new traits in the offspring. The higher that genetic diversity is in a population, the better the population is going to be able to respond to environmental stressors, whether that's drought, famine, disease, wildfire. Higher genetic diversity is going to allow a population to be more likely to survive that environmental stressor, because there's more likelihood that some set of genomes is going to have an adaptation that allows that organism to survive that particular stressor. So if we look at this example of our potato crop here, we have a crop of potatoes that's very diverse. And when blight comes, only a small portion of the crop is killed because these other ones are blight resistant. But if all our potatoes are the same species, they're all exactly the same, then when blight comes, it's going to destroy them all. And so because there was no diversity in that population, so none of the individuals were able to survive that particular blight. Okay, let's talk about bottlenecks. So when we talk about a bottleneck event, we are talking about some event that drastically reduces population size, and that's going to kill off a lot of the organisms. And it's not about their genetic abilities, it's just whatever that environmental disaster was, it kills off lots of the organisms. Because it's random, it's not selecting for any one thing, it's not going to represent the genetic diversity of the original population. And so often when we talk about a bottleneck effect, what we wind up having after the bottleneck is a population that looks very different from the original population. Some of the traits may be gone entirely. You may have a new dominant set of traits. So if we look at our example here, you can see that we initially have a pretty even distribution of blue and white and just a few yellows. And through our bottlenecking event, we're going to wind up with a lot of blue, a little bit of white, and no yellow at all. And so our surviving population looks very different from our original population, but the offspring of that surviving population are going to look like that surviving population. So we will have lost an entire set of traits, and we're going to have very few that carry the other traits. They reduce that genetic diversity. That makes it more vulnerable to future environmental disturbances, because if we've lost an entire set of traits and those traits are necessary to survive the next environmental disturbance, the population simply does not have those traits. So if we look at the example of our mice here, before we had 40% black, 10% brown, and 50% white. Through our bottleneck, only 3 of our mice in our population survived. They happened to be black and brown. And so our surviving population is 2/3 black and 1/3 brown and no white. And that means that the offspring are going to be very similar, 2/3 black, 1/3 brown, and no white. So if the environment changes in such a way that a white mouse would be advantaged because of camouflage or whatever other reason, this population is not going to be able to survive because they don't have that trait. Okay, another impact frequently occurs after a bottlenecking event, and that's called inbreeding depression. So inbreeding is when organisms mate with closely related family members. And so this leads to a higher chance of offspring having harmful genetic mutations, because those harmful genetic mutations are often recessive genes. But when you have closely related organisms mating, they're more likely to both be carrying a recessive gene. They get that similar genotype from both parents, and we wind up with an expression of a recessive gene that isn't normally seen. Smaller populations, because there are fewer organisms to breed, are more likely to experience inbreeding. It's more difficult to find a non-related mate. So as an example, the Florida panther population decreased in the 1900s down to about 30 individuals because of hunting and because of habitat loss. The inbreeding depression from that population going all the way down to only 30 individuals led to some characteristics in the Florida panthers that had been previously recessive and unexpressed. So those were kinked tails, they had heart defects, they had low sperm counts, they had issues with the males having undescended testicles. In 1995, in an effort to preserve the Florida panther population, they introduced pumas, which are just panthers by another name, from Texas into the Florida population to bring in more genetic diversity. And that has brought the Florida panther population back to a healthy place. Okay, so we've talked about diversity at the ecosystem level, at the species level, and at the genetic level. And now we're going to talk about how all of that comes together to make an ecosystem more resilient and what that really means. So when we talk about resilience, we're talking about the ability of an ecosystem to bounce back, to come back to its original conditions after there's a major disturbance. Again, that can be a natural disturbance like a windstorm, a fire, a flood, but it can also be a human-caused disturbance. It can be clear cutting, it can be development. If we have higher species diversity, we're going to have higher ecosystem resilience. There are going to be some plant species that have survived and can repopulate that disturbed ground. They can anchor exposed soil. They provide food and habitat for animal species. So after a disturbance, we frequently talk about secondary succession. And so these are the pioneer species. These are the first species to come back after that devastating event, and they provide food and habitat for the others. So you can see that after this natural disaster this is actually in Florida, that we have a significant change. But if we have enough diversity of our species, there are going to be organisms that are going to help this ecosystem bounce back. Beavers building dams is going to create better flow patterns. The alligators actually also dig burrows that help with those flow patterns. And so by having a diversity of species, this ecosystem is going to be better able to bounce back. It's going to be more resilient. Okay, so now that we're more comfortable with FRQs, we're going to be doing a practice part, little tiny part of a practice FRQ at the end of each of our videos. So today's practice FRQ asks you to describe one of the 3 levels of biodiversity, whether that's ecosystem, species, or genetic biodiversity, and then explain how that high biodiversity at the level that you described, not any of the other levels, but at the level that you described, is beneficial to ecosystems. As always, make note of any of your questions, and I look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow.